dia a todos. Bom dia a todos aqui presentes. Bom dia a todos que estão nos acompanhando via YouTube, né? Nós tivemos 281 inscrições em counting, né? De interessados em participar desse ciclo de conferências promovido e faz parte da Cátedra de Cientista Residente do Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Unicamp. Agradecemos muito a equipe aqui do IEL por nos ajudar nessa primeira transmissão, e a equipe do IDEA que está aqui presente, a todos os interessados. Vou me restringir a esses agradecimentos por hora. Primeiro, eu gostaria de passar ao diretor do IEL a palavra, a quem também agradeço muito pela presença e acolhida.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Muita satisfação que a gente recebe aqui no IEL, esse projeto que é organizado, né, pelo Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Unicamp, né, a IDEA, que é aqui representado na questão da professora Isabela. Acho que é uma iniciativa muito interessante. Eu vejo aqui, inclusive, pela quantidade de pessoas, né, que estão participando, essa possibilidade, inclusive, de transmissão online para que mais pessoas possam participar. Acho que é fundamental. Então, primeiramente, gostaria de cumprimentar por essa iniciativa e dizer que o IEL está dando todo o apoio. Queria cumprimentar aqui o professor Flávio, diretor do IEL, e nosso especialista em grego aqui no IEL, né? Cumprimentar o professor Nino Coelho, diretor da Faculdade de Direito, né, de Ribeirão Preto. Cumprimentar também o professor emérito, professor Mário Martinez, que é presidente do Conselho Científico, né, do IDEA. Cumprimentar a professora Patrícia, aqui também presente, cumprimentar a todos e cumprimentar, sobretudo, aqui o professor David Konstan. Welcome to our university. E esperar que vocês tenham um evento muito interessante, e com certeza será. Acho que traz um tema, né, tão interessante, falar de vingança. Quando eu vi a primeira vez, inclusive, né, evento, Retribuição e Reconciliação, né, achei tão interessante, porque acho, de uma forma, pensar, fazer esse percurso, inclusive um percurso histórico, né, olhar para isso e olhar para o que vivenciamos hoje, né, e aqui não dá para deixar de falar, né, da própria situação política pela qual passamos, né. Acho que talvez pensar retribuição e reconciliação a partir de um processo histórico é algo sempre interessante, né, e sobretudo no contexto atual. Mas olhar isso ao longo da história talvez nos ensine bastante a pensar sobre isso. Então, agradeço muito sua vinda. Thank you very much. E desejo, apenas desejar a todos vocês um ótimo evento, né, inclusive aí nas palestras subsequentes. E IEL está aí sempre à disposição. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professor Petrilson. Farei uma breve apresentação, muito mais breve do que David Konstan, professor David Konstan mereceria. Queria agradecer também a presença de todos os mencionados, né, o professor Flávio Ribeiro de Oliveira, nosso moderador, antes de tudo, o professor convidado David Konstan, cientista residente no ano de 2003 dos estudos avançados, aos colegas demais presentes, aos alunos dos nossos cursos de pós-graduação e graduação, né? A professora Patrícia, que também está aqui, professora da área, nos acompanhando. A todos os que estão, como eu mencionei, assistindo, inclusive a professora Carol Martins da Rocha e o professor Carlos Renato de Rosário, da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, da Universidade do Estado do Amazonas, que nos acompanham também com grupos de alunos respectivos, né, e demais colegas. É efetivamente imensa a minha alegria e honra poder estar aqui em nome do IDEA. Nesse ponto, eu represento também o coordenador do IDEA, que é o professor Cristiano Lira, que teve um outro compromisso no Rio de Janeiro. O presidente do Conselho Consultivo Científico-Cultural do IDEA, o professor Mário Martinez, professor emérito da Unicamp. Toda a equipe do IDEA que está aqui presente, a Thaís, Marinho, Guilherme, Gorgulho e a Janaína, que está de pé. Esse Instituto, o IDEA, eu pouco conhecia, ele é uma iniciativa da reitoria, fundada por um dos professores do IEL, professor Alcir Pécora, que foi o antigo diretor, e eu fiquei muito contente que esse ano o professor David Konstan, professor da área de humanidades, atual docente da New York University, por longo tempo docente da Universidade de Brown, foi quando eu conheci, está representando, então, está sendo o cientista residente do IDEA. Nessa oportunidade, ele vai nos falar sobre a história de conceitos tão presentes em nossa cultura e, eu diria, diante das circunstâncias políticas que temos vivido ultimamente, no mundo e, sobretudo, no Brasil, tão importantes, que é pensar o que significa esse sentimento de vingança, o que significa a justiça, a retribuição ou retaliação, e o que significa a reconciliação, que estratégias existiam e existem. Ele vai tangenciar vários outros conceitos, como o conceito de raiva, o conceito de perdão, o conceito de reconhecimento, arrependimento, conceitos que normalmente nos parecem tão naturais, atemporais. Na verdade, o David Konstan tem mostrado que tanto esses quanto os conceitos de emoção, de pecado, temas fundamentais à nossa civilização, eles são historicamente datados, culturalmente datados e diferem, e tudo isso faz parte de um necessário autoconhecimento, Envolve, e aí, a partir do momento que temos autoconhecimento, podemos pensar em que medida nós podemos escolher como lidar com situações pessoais, políticas, morais, econômicas, estéticas, etc. Bom, os alunos mais jovens aqui presentes talvez possam não se dar conta o que significa a presença de David Konstan nessa universidade. Para reflexão sobre temas das emoções, da beleza, do pecado, da história da religião, do direito, etc. Eu, efetivamente, confesso que eu não fazia ideia, caro David, quando eu conheci, há 23 anos atrás, aqui, num evento promovido na Unicamp pelos professores do IFIS, Maricela Bresciani e Isabel Marçom, que serão moderadores aqui em uma das nossas conferências futuras. E depois eu tive a honra de assistir a um curso sobre as emoções antigas, promovido pela USP, pelos colegas de letras clássicas da USP. Eu já sabia de seus textos fundamentais na área da comédia romana, da filosofia, da história antiga, são centenas de publicações. David Konstan nasceu, acho que não é segredo para ninguém que ele nasceu em 1940, e ele tem um apetite imenso por saber e um entusiasmo imenso em compartilhar seus textos e suas ideias, também por meio de publicações, palestras, bancas, em vários países do mundo. A sua experiência profissional envolve os vários continentes. Contamos esses dias 99 países, não foi? 99 countries. Enfim, ainda bem que eu não sabia disso, porque senão eu ficaria ainda mais tímida e talvez não estivéssemos aqui. De toda maneira, eu gostaria de destacar, além de tudo que a gente já pode ler no currículo e nas entrevistas, de David Konstan, tem uma entrevista muito bonita de autoria do Guilherme Gorgulho, aqui presente. Eu gostaria de destacar a minha experiência pessoal com David Konstan em termos acadêmicos, que é a sua enorme modéstia E eu ouso dizer que essa modéstia é um instrumento epistemológico do David Konstan, né? No sentido da ironia socrática, né? O David Konstan é uma pessoa que é extremamente requisitado, todo mundo está querendo, everybody loves David here em Brasil, todo mundo quer que o David Konstan vá para sua universidade, porque, além de tudo que ele sabe, ele tem uma imensa disponibilidade em ouvir, em rever seus pontos de vista, em ressignificá-los, em uma imensa generosidade em ouvir e ensinar. Então, eu usaria dizer que esse é um dos segredos. Os outros, a sua esposa, Pura Nieto, que está aqui nos ouvindo pelo YouTube, que vai dar também um curso a partir de segunda-feira, via ideia. Os outros segredos é ela quem sabe, mas eu sei que essa modéstia epistemológica, né, e essa generosidade imensa são um dos segredos de sua eterna juventude, beleza. Ele pediu que eu ressaltasse uma coisa que eu vejo nele, e charme, né, com que nos encantará com seus pensamentos sempre inovadores, né? Ele não precisaria ser inovador a essa altura diante do que ele já fez, mas ele ainda é, e por isso a gente não se cansa de ouvi-lo. Muito obrigada, David, pela sua presença.
Thank you, Dean. Can you hear me? Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, all of you, for coming, for the invitation to be here again. Bom dia. That's my last words in Portuguese. Good morning. Não falo português. I will, as you know, I will read the lecture, which you all have. You can see on the screen. It is on your computers, and everyone who is in the virtual audience also has it so that it can follow this. I wish I could give this in Portuguese. Maybe the last lecture I will be able to. I hope so. Well, I will begin, and then we can have conversation at the end. So, is revenge bad? Is it a primitive desire or emotion, something that is incompatible with civilized societies, such as we imagine our society to be? Should we, as individuals, have developed beyond such a psychological stage? Of course, there are still offenses and offenders in the world, people who may do us harm, even if we have never harmed them or done anything wrong. But is revenge the right response to such injustice or injuries? Are there other, better ways to react so that we avoid further harm, to be sure, but do not, in addition, wish harm to our enemies? Ought we, in the words of Jesus, love not only our friends, for, as he said, that is easy, but also our enemies? And does such love eliminate the desire for revenge? These are some of the questions that will occupy us over the next 8 weeks in this course. They are only some of the questions, since we will be looking not only at revenge, but also at retribution. We will consider whether there is a real difference between revenge and retribution, or just a semantic one. We will also examine strategies of reconciliation that do not necessarily depend on or involve revenge. Perhaps retribution or fair compensation is one such mechanism. There is also forgiveness, which certainly seems incompatible with revenge. Is forgiveness a good thing? Is it always a good thing? We shall be examining these issues both on a personal and on a national scale. What happens when one group has oppressed another? Is forgiveness warranted then? Social peace is a strong value, and we all hope to achieve it. But at any cost? Are there situations in which revenge of some sort is warranted? I just pause for a moment to say we will be looking at South Africa, We will be looking at situations in Latin America later, where these issues will come up specifically. We will read Bishop Tutu. We will read criticisms of forgiveness. So we will read testimony from concentration camp survivors and ask whether forgiveness is obligatory for them. Now, as you know, I am a classicist by training, and I have given most attention over the course of my life to the way the ancient Greeks and Romans felt and thought. I have wanted to see how they regarded pity, friendship, anger, love, beauty, and other things. And I have also meditated on how they felt about revenge. We will be reading various modern texts on revenge, and in the final 2 sessions of this course, we'll be devoted to some modern cases of harm and reconciliation on a broad canvas. Let me pause to say we will be looking at victims also of sexual abuse. How should they forgive, if they should? I will just mention now that in the 7th lecture, we will have a guest by way of a podcast from Judith Herman, who has just came out 3 weeks ago, a very important book on how survivors of sexual abuse regard justice. What do they want? This will be, she will join us by video. In any case, but for the first session today, I would like to take a look at 2 poems which were foundational for Greek classical culture. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So just today, we'll concentrate on those 2 texts, and we'll come back to them again and again over the semester. I want to see how revenge works. Every Greek child had heard these verses from infancy and knew many of them by heart. It was in this sense something like the Bible, though the Greek epics were not considered sacred or the word of God. What is more, revenge is central to both poems. So let us take a look at how it functions in each, and then proceed to analyze its role and see whether it is as primitive a motive as we might be inclined to suppose. The first word of the Iliad, as many of you know, is menes, a rather elevated word that is commonly translated into English as wrath, ahaiva, probably close to it. By the way, I once gave a lecture in Brazil on ahaiva, which is published in Portuguese, back when I still could speak some of it. And indeed, anger or rage pervades the poem, along with the desire for revenge. And they are the basis of the 2 major movements in the Iliad. The first movement in the Iliad involves Achilles' withdrawal from the Greek fleet, the Greek armada, that was besieging Troy, hoping to destroy the city because Paris, the son of the Trojan king, had eloped with Helen, the wife of Menelaus. Now, this is indeed an overarching example of revenge. Here is a woman who runs off with a man. They go to Troy, and what do the Greeks decide to do? Destroy the city, kill every man, and enslave every woman and child. And we will be reading the play Hecuba later, discussing it, in which the surviving women have to face various conflicts. Is this reasonable? That's the question. Now, Herodotus, the historian Herodotus, criticized this with a touch of irony. In describing the origins of the great war between Persia and the Greeks, I should say most Greeks, because many Greeks sided with Persia. We forget that. But many of the Greeks were on the Persian side, including Herodotus' own city. Were on the Persian side, not on the Greek resistance. But in any case, Herodotus said that according to the Persians. By carrying off Helen, Paris was simply doing what Jason and the Argonauts did with Medea, and we will be reading and discussing Medea later in the semester. If the Trojans refused to give Helen back, well, it was just tit for tat. But then the Greeks did something seriously wrong. The Persians acknowledged that it is unjust to carry women off, but to avenge such an act is foolish, not least because the women were taken willingly, as was certainly the case with both Medea and Helen. The Persians conclude, and so I quote, the Greeks, for the sake of a Lacedaemonian woman, that's Helen, recruited a great armada, came to Asia, and destroyed the power of Priam, the king of Troy. Ever since then, we have regarded the Greeks as our enemies. The story, this one that I've just told, is clearly a fiction, but it makes a serious point. If revenge is approved of, there is still a question of proportion. One member of a community commits a wrong against another state. Yes, his own compatriots should have punished him or paid some recompense. In fact, the Trojans later offered to do so. Is this reason to wipe out the city entirely, killing every male and reducing the women and children to slavery? Now, it's true, this is only the backstory of the Iliad. The context, not the focus of the plot. But perhaps it's more insidious for that, since it's simply taken for granted. Now, you see the point here. We read the Iliad and we're concentrating on Achilles. And we don't ask ourselves, but what are the Greeks doing there? Why are they destroying this entire city? Is it worth it? Is this what revenge is all about when you read this in the poems? And yet, is the war, in fact, an instance of revenge or of retribution or requital? We will be discussing the distinction between revenge and retribution next week, assuming there is a distinction. So let's use the word for now, punishment, instead of those two words. Punishment also can be excessive. We say that punishment should fit the crime. Remember that the Trojan prince Paris abducted Menelaus' wife, but it's not Menelaus alone who is fighting in Troy with an army of his own subjects. This is a pan-Greek mission, and the other kings and leaders, Agamemnon is Menelaus' brother, all the others who were there are not in it for their own satisfaction, but for Menelaus' sake. They joined the expedition not out of a sense of personal injury, but out of a sense of duty and justice. Or Odysseus, there's a story that Odysseus tried to get out of going. He didn't want to go to Troy. He pretended to be crazy. And he was plowing the fields, his fields with, instead of an ox, he was plowing it himself. But the other Greeks were smart. They took his infant son and threw it in front of the plow. And he stopped and realized he shouldn't do that, so they knew he wasn't crazy. And off he went to Troy. At the beginning of the Iliad, however, Agamemnon insults Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, personally. Or at least that's how Achilles sees it. By taking back a war prize, a woman, that he had previously awarded him. Why Achilles saw this act as so great an insult is an interesting question. But he was so offended that he was on the point of killing Agamemnon, but finally he settled on withdrawing from battle and watching his side suffer defeat, which he prayed for. Someone insults you publicly, subjects you to dishonor. This is the rage or meanness that Achilles experiences, and he wants to hurt Agamemnon and all those who failed to stand up for him. He succeeds, and after the Greek side suffers severe losses, Agamemnon comes begging, or rather, he sends 3 men to do the begging for him. And he offers Achilles a huge payment if he returns to the fighting. Achilles refuses, still smarting, still stinging from what he regards as his public humiliation when he was treated like a wandering beggar. Those are his words. What did Achilles want? Why did he not agree to the big ransom? His best friend advised him to accept the payment and get over his peevishness like a child. You know, there is a book called Childlike Achilles that is about Achilles as an infantile overreaction to the insult. Is this the case? His friends consider a king's ransom that Agamemnon offers as adequate compensation. Is Achilles left with nothing more than childish fight? Some scholars have suggested that what irks Achilles, what irritates Achilles, is precisely the fact that Agamemnon has not come in person to make an apology and show that he is truly penitent and not just buying his way out of a difficulty. Such a display of sincere repentance is often considered to be a necessary condition for forgiveness. If I'm to forgive you, I want you to be full of repentance. Is this what Achilles wants? Some sign that Agamemnon has accepted his guilt, is willing to confess it, and realizes that this can only be done in person and not through proxies, sending people. I myself believe that this is not what Achilles expects, or that anyone listening to the poem back then would have expected it. But the reasons why I think forgiveness is not an issue here will have to wait till the week after next, when we will look at forgiveness itself. And as many of you will know, as you mentioned, I wrote a book called Before Forgiveness, in which I argued that our conception of forgiveness was not a fundamental way of creating reconciliation among the Greeks and Romans. That the idea of forgiveness was rather introduced in the Bible, above all in the Hebrew Bible, and then in a different form in the New Testament. But in both of those cases, forgiveness was almost exclusively the role of God. God forgives, we don't. God forgives sins, we don't forgive sins. We can reconcile, but we don't forgive. There's a special word in the Hebrew Bible for forgiveness, and it's used 75 times, and the only subject of the verb is God. But we'll go to that, not so much this, but other aspects of forgiveness later in 3 weeks. So, but perhaps if Agamemnon had come to Achilles in person, or even better, had made his offer in the presence of the entire army, Achilles could have inflicted on him the same sense of shame that Achilles experienced when Agamemnon demeaned him in public. Now look what I'm pointing out here. It's not that you want him to confess. It's that you want him to feel ashamed and hurt in public in the same way that he did to you. This, I think, the Greeks did understand, but we'll come to reasons why later. When a person is dishonored, the objective is not simply to punish the offender, but to make him feel what you have felt, the same kind of mortification. If Achilles stubbornly refuses to be reconciled with Agamemnon, it may be because Agamemnon still retained his dignity despite his losses. Revenge, at least in such cases, will have to do with loss of pride and respect rather than material damage. This too is something we'll be examining later, in fact, next week, because this is exactly what Aristotle says revenge is all about. But we'll have to wait. We're building the background here, and each week we will develop another perspective on it. Achilles will return to the fray, but only when his dearest companion, Patroclus, is killed by Hector. Patroclus, unlike Achilles, Patroclus felt pity for his suffering comrades, and he asked Achilles to allow him at least to lead out the troops and help defend against the Trojans. And he wore Achilles' armor so that he gave the impression temporarily that Achilles himself was back, and that would frighten the Trojans. When Patroclus is slain, Achilles finally puts on special armor sent to him by the gods, and he fights and slays Hector in a one-on-one duel. Still not satisfied, when he is back among the Greek encampment, he drags Hector's corpse behind his chariot every day, abusing his dead enemy, though the body is miraculously conserved. We'll discuss later why it's conserved miraculously in another session. Finally, the gods themselves find this behavior excessive. Although Hera, that's Jupiter, Zeus's wife, who is a partisan of Achilles, thinks it's okay because Achilles is the son of a goddess, and so he has special privileges. Gods will be gods. This then looks like a highly personal case of revenge. Achilles has been hurt, though not in this instance insulted. He acts more out of grief than a sense of injured pride. Perhaps the ferocity of his vengeance against Hector is a kind of displaced acting out of the anger he still harbors against Agamemnon, which he professed to have forgotten once he needed to rejoin the fighting and avenge Patroclus. Just let me remind you, we'll come back to this again, and many things come back to. Achilles had said, I've given over my anger to Agamemnon. I'm back. I'm now going to kill Hector because he killed my dearest friend Patroclus. So he said, my anger is all over. But here he is angry again, or so it seems. And so I say, did he forget it? When he did, Jonathan Shea, in a book called Achilles in Vietnam, suggests that Achilles is a clear case of war trauma, typically induced by two events: a loss of respect for the commander, this is the case of Agamemnon, who insulted him, and a loss of a dear friend. Let me just remind you that Jonathan Shea is a psychoanalyst who specialized in traumatic patients who suffered trauma after the Vietnam War, in which the United States was a major player. Many soldiers came home and experienced severe trauma. And what he discovered was that those who most suffered reported repeatedly two events that happened to them. One, their commander lost respect for some reason or other, insulted them, behaved unjustly. So they no longer felt the war was a just war. And secondly, on top of that, their dearest friend was killed. And one is interesting. I don't mention this in the paper, but I'll just mention it now. Every one of them described his dear friend as very mild, peaceful, gentle. The same way Achilles describes Patroclus. My gentle friend. These guys were killers. Patroclus was a fierce fighter. But when the traumatized people remember their friend, they remember him as gentle in almost every case. And so Jonathan Shea said, when Achilles comes back to fight so crazily, when he mutilates the body, the dead body, he is suffering from war trauma, just the way his patients were. He recovers. Achilles recovers in the way many of these patients did not, for reasons that Jonathan Shea explains, and we may go into later on. In any case, whereas the other Greeks believed that Achilles was overdoing his resentment and that it was time to be reconciled with Agamemnon, now that Agamemnon has humbled himself, Achilles' violent antagonism toward Hector accepted as natural, and only the mutilation of the corpse is regarded as excessive. Ancient Greek culture was highly militarized. Modern scholars, and we're going to come back to this, have debated whether Greek men ever experienced post-traumatic distress disorder after engaging in battle, with some scholars arguing that they were so conditioned to value courage and the slaughter of enemies that violence in war was simply a normal part of life. We'll go back to this, but one of the arguments is that when modern fighters come back to peaceful life and experience traumas, one of the reasons is their values in peacetime are very different from the values in war, and they experience a comfort. We have a Judeo-Christian morality, Islamic morality. It's not an accident that the name Islam means peace. We have a value of peace, and if we value that, but nevertheless have killed many people, we could feel internal conflict. The argument is the Greeks had no such internal conflict. They were conditioned to value war, and they came home and were proud of it. So whether this is true or not, it has been argued. But still, in times of peace, there were other ways to settle conflict. For example, by accepting a payment. When Achilles refuses to accept Agamemnon's offer of fabulous amounts of wealth and even giving his own daughter in marriage to Achilles, the great warrior Ajax, who was one of the three friends of Achilles that Agamemnon had sent to negotiate with him, spoke up in indignation. And I'm reading from the translation of Richmond Latimer. So Ajax says to Achilles, son of Laertes, that's Odysseus, says to Odysseus, and seed of Zeus, resourceful Odysseus, and Ajax, and another person named Phoenix were the three ambassadors who came to talk to Achilles. Let us go. I think that nothing will be accomplished by argument on this errand, namely trying to get Achilles to come back to the battle. It is best to go back quickly and tell this story, although it is not good, to the Danaans, that's one of the words for the Greeks, who sit there waiting for us to come back, seeing that Achilles has made savage the proud-hearted spirit within his body. He is hard and does not remember that friend's affection wherein we honored him by the ships far beyond all others. In other words, he isn't a dishonored vagabond, pitiless. And yet, here's the important point that Ajax said. He's saying this to Achilles after Achilles has refused the ransom and he still spitefully stays out of the war. He says, and yet, a man takes from his brother's slayer, somebody who killed his own brother, the blood price, or the price of a child who was killed. And the guilty one, when he is largely repaid, still stays in the country. And the injured man's heart is curbed, and his pride and his anger when he has taken the price. But the gods put in your breast, he says to Achilles, a spirit not to be placated, bad, for the sake of one single girl, which is the prize that you got. Yet now we offer you 7 girls, surpassingly lovely. Ajax's idea of equivalence, which maybe it's not such a bad idea, and much besides these. Oh, somebody took my wife and gave me 7. Well, never even think about that. Okay. Now make gracious the spirit within you. Respect, he's saying to Achilles, respect your own house. See, we are under the same roof with you. From the multitude of the Danaans, we who desire beyond all, turn the page, beyond all others to have your honor and love out of all the Achaeans. A very powerful speech. Now, what is especially interesting about this passage, I believe, and I don't think most scholars have not paid attention to it, is that Ajax's advice does not apply to Achilles' situation. It sounds like great advice, Achilles is not resentful over the loss of a friend or a kinsman. He is hurt because Agamemnon humiliated him in public. As he says in reply to Ajax, son of Telamon, that's Ajax, seed of Zeus, Ajax goes back a couple generations, and then there's Zeus behind it all. Ajax, Lord of the people, all that you have said seems spoken after my own mind. Yet, still the heart in me swells up in anger when I remember the disgrace that he wrought upon me before the Argives, another word for the Greeks, the son of Atreus, that's Agamemnon, as if I were some dishonored vagabond. One thing I want to point out here, because we will come back to it, is what if he had been a dishonored vagabond? Well, then, okay. The point is he's not. And status matters. Status matters. Who you are and what your rank is matters. And when Aristotle will talk about anger and revenge, he will take that into account. The way we might not. We might say every human being has dignity. The Greeks would say not the same amount. Very clear about this. Agamemnon treated him as though he was a vagabond. Now, what critics have also not noticed is that Ajax's advice does apply to Achilles' later rage against who did kill a person dear to him, and what is more, did offer to pay a huge sum, including the return of Helen if Achilles would spare him. Later, in fact, Achilles will accept a ransom, not for Hector's life, it's too late for that, but for his body, which he agrees to return to Hector's father, Priam, so that it can receive a proper burial, even though earlier Achilles has said he was going to let wild beasts and birds and dogs consume the body. Actually, Ajax's example of a blood price does not entirely fit even the later situation, since it evidently applies to killings that were committed in peacetime, in one's own community, and not under conditions of war, where killing one's enemy is the whole purpose. But the situation is similar. For in the first case, earlier, Achilles is angry because he was dishonored, while in the second, he is motivated by grief rather than a personal insult. Does this matter? Does the two types according to ancient Greek way of thinking? So that an ancient Greek reading this poem would conclude that Achilles is angry in the first part, angry in the second part, and that's that. We're going to see that scholars, the opening word, rage, wrath, anger, he's angry first, he's angry second, change the object. First he's angry at Agamemnon, then different kinds of revenge. By the way, on to modern examples of seems to be a unifying theme. Yeah, some scholars have argued poem it's this is death and was legendary, including For example. So what she argues is that people who have committed offenses, they feel guilty. And they suffer severe physical symptoms. There's a beautiful movie made, it's a Danish movie, about a year or two ago, in which a prisoner, a young man who had served as a prison guard in ex-Yugoslavia, he's Serbian, and he had been responsible, when the time he was 18 years old, for very severe tortures, sometimes killing the prisoners in his control. He was condemned by the World Court at The Hague and spent 10 years in prison. When he came out, he felt worse than when he went in. He had not paid. And he came and back to the very scene of the crime and asked those who survived, whom he had tortured, when they had died, their relatives, to come, and he begged forgiveness. It's interesting that not a single person was able to forgive him, but he needed it. And we're going to be seeing, not next time, but the time after, a brief movie, not one that was going to be horrible for you. I think it will be, it's a beautiful, beautiful movie, about half an hour, on forgiveness in the context of Rwanda, in the genocide of the Tutsi population against the Hutu population. It's a very sensitive movie and a very beautiful one. And so I think that despite the horrors that went on, you will feel moved and not repelled by the film. But we'll see that 2 times from now, again involving somebody who had committed crimes, the person who had suffered from them, and who had gone to prison voluntarily and come out and still not been able to deal with what he felt he had done. So we'll look at those situations later. In any case, what Dita Marie asks further is whether such responses reflect a moral judgment on the part of the perpetrator. It's an important subject. And there have been studies and also movies in which it has been addressed. But it also happens that the victim of abuse, rather than the perpetrator, experiences guilt for some action that provoked the offense. You've actually seen many of these cases in domestic abuse, where the person abused feels guilty. And what did I do to deserve this? So we have many cases. Could such a feeling, especially when it's not acknowledged, cause people to exact more severe revenge than the cause might warrant? We will return to all these issues, but it's time now to turn to the Odyssey. Here too, there are 2 episodes in which revenge figures prominently. I'm taking a quick look at the time to make sure I don't go over too much. Although different from the Iliad. The first is the famous scene in which Odysseus, on his way home after Troy has been destroyed, blinds the Cyclops because the Cyclops had trapped Odysseus and several of his men inside his cave and proceeded to eat them, saving Odysseus for last. When Odysseus manages to escape and return to his ship, he taunts the Cyclops and identifies himself by name. I am Odysseus. With this, the Cyclops is able to call down curses upon Odysseus. And since the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, the sea god, and Odysseus is still at sea, the curses will result in a 10-year delay before Odysseus manages to return home. Some have suggested that Odysseus was not entirely innocent, since he was helping himself to the Cyclops' goods while the Cyclops was out tending his sheep. His excuse, this is excuse that strangers should be treated hospitably, and that he was simply assuming that this is what the Cyclops would have wanted, is somehow hollow. One more time, violently. But the Cyclops seems to lack any moral concerns in his decision to kill and eat his guests. and his action does not look like a form of vengeance. We may then suppose that Odysseus is wholly justified in harming the Cyclops, not only for practical reasons that blinding him is the only way he can save himself, but also as punishment that the Cyclops deserved for what he had done. And yet, the fact that he succeeds in avenging himself on Odysseus, the fact that the Cyclops succeeds in avenging himself on Odysseus in return, causing him prolonged suffering and subjecting him to a highly dangerous situation in his house when he finally does get home, suggests that there may be other ways to evaluate the actors here. Now, so this is, what I'm saying is, Odysseus finds a Cyclops. He has every reason to do so. But in the poem, the Cyclops gets his own back. He delays the return of Odysseus for 10 years. Why? Why does Homer present a situation in which Odysseus, having killed or blinded the Cyclops who's eating his own men, and about to eat Odysseus himself, why does he put Odysseus also in this perilous position? That's the kind of question I like to ask. So now some scholars have focused on Odysseus's boasting of his action, which is what renders him susceptible to the Cyclops' curse, since you need a name to curse somebody properly. Is it that one should not take pride in revenge? You commit an act. You kill your enemy out of necessity, not viciousness. And bragging about it is a sign of arrogance that the gods are likely to look upon with disfavor. As we will see, there is reason to suppose that such exulting is not proper in Odysseus' own judgment later. That takes us to the second and crucial episode of revenge, which governs the entire plot poem, namely Odysseus' slaughter of the 108 suitors who have occupied his house for the past 3 years and courted his wife, Penelope. Now the final episode, and we're coming to the end. I expect you all know the story. I need only recall that the suitors have made themselves very much at home in Odysseus' house while he was away. They have been eating his herds, drinking his wine, and courting his wife in expectation that Penelope will ultimately decide to marry one of them, who will in turn become the ruler of Ithaca in place of Odysseus, who they believe is dead. The vengeance that Odysseus exacts is terrible. He kills every last one of them, ignoring their excuses, and offers to repay the damage to his property. This is the climax of the epic, and Odysseus is the hero. I might add that he remained a hero for centuries to come and was honored by Plato at the end of his Republic. And he was regarded as a sage, a wise person by the Stoics. It's not just the primitive epic. It is wise philosophers treat Odysseus as their model. Stoics regarded Hercules and Odysseus as model figures. So we have to really dealing with something odd here. Granted, so the question is, could he have come to an agreement with the suitors? Okay, leaving 108 potential enemies alive is risky. But now he was home, and there was no chance that any of them would replace him as king. Did they have any reason to remain hostile to him and remain a threat? Was so great a slaughter necessary or justified in some other way? These are questions that are rarely posed in this form, because Homer seems to favor Odysseus' actions and even to glamorize them. If you've read the Odyssey, how many people how many times have you asked yourself at the end, did he have to do this? He sounds like such a hero. We don't think about it that way. Yes, it was a great achievement, given the uneven ratio of forces, with just his son Telemachus and 2 slaves fighting alongside Odysseus against such a numerous crowd. Martin West, great scholar, has argued that the author of our epic has vastly inflated the original number of suitors out of a melodramatic instinct, something like superhero movies of today, where one hero fights thousands of enemies. We too like to see the underdog, who is possessed of extraordinary powers, defeat a large host of bad guys. Is this what the Odyssey is offering its listeners and readers? An action movie type of thrill with little attention to moral issues and whether the suitors deserve to die? It seems to me a good question. We're going to come back to this issue of vicarious revenge. This is a real question, I think. And there's also a question as to what the suitors thought they were doing by occupying Odysseus' home like this. The poem suggests that they were simply feasting at his expense and abusing his son and wife. But there are good reasons to think that the suitors themselves did not think that they were coming out ahead, financially speaking. So the question is, there's 108 men sitting in Odysseus' house, wooing his wife, who's 20 years older than they are. Why? What do they think they're doing? Are they going there for a free meal? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What are they doing there? What's their view of what they're doing there? That's one of the questions that I have asked. And eventually, my answer to this question will come out in Portuguese, but not yet. In any case, one of the suitors says that they have spent far more on gifts for Penelope than they could ever get back. So it's not a profitable enterprise for them. Yes, if Penelope marries one of them, he will inherit the property or what's left of it after all their deprivations. But to bet so much on a 1 over 108 chance is not really good business, even if, as Martin West claims, the original number was just 12 instead of 108. No, they must have had another purpose in mind, and we can figure out what it was. It was only after had been absent for 7 years, with no word from him at all, that the suitors began to compete for the hand of Penelope. They clearly assumed that Odysseus was dead. There may have been a customary 7-year limitation in the case of prolonged absence, and they believed that the kingship would and should devolve upon whoever succeeded in marrying Penelope, just as Oedipus became king by marrying Jocasta. Homer, however, has obscured this motive almost entirely and represented the suitors as mere hooligans or thieves and squatters also, although it appears that they go back to their homes every night. For good measure, Homer has the suitors plan to assassinate Telemachus. These are bad men. So, granted then, as Homer presents them, the suitors have taken undue advantage of Odysseus' absence. But do they deserve to die? Is this the best solution? There is a certain precedent for such violence in the Odyssey itself. When Odysseus is sailing back to Ithaca with his last ship, he lost the others in various accidents and attacks. He stops at an island that is sacred to the sun, on which there are cattle that it is prohibited to eat. The sea is becalmed, and Odysseus and his men are suffering extreme hunger. In the end, his men sacrifice one of the sacred animals, and the sun god's punishment is immediate. He kills them all except for Odysseus, who had refrained from such sacrilege. It is why Odysseus in the end arrives home alone, having lost all the companions who were under his command. The moral would seem to be, do not eat someone else's cattle, or vengeance will be swift and total, just like that of Odysseus when he reclaims his palace. Are we to understand that there is something sacrilegious also about the invasion of Odysseus' property and the consumption of his livestock on the part of the suitors? In other words, what's going on here? Is it simply invade as cattle, or are we talking about a defense of private property? That you invade private property. Just yesterday, I read in the United States, yesterday, the day before, a person found an intruder in his house, shot and killed him. The other day, you probably have seen it in your newspapers as well, although in the United States, somebody shooting and killing someone is so frequent, it just takes the back page. I'll give you a brief pause. As you know, many of you know, my wife is Spanish, and we got married in Spain, and we were going for our Valladolid, an important city in Spain, and we were stopped at a street corner in the car, and all of a sudden we heard shooting. Bang, bang. My wife did not know what it was. I did. She got underneath the seat. I looked. Police were converging on a group of robbers, and there was a shootout. They had killed 4 people in robbing a bank. They were shot. They weren't killed. They were wounded. They were led right by our car. We were right in the front. And they were led by our car and could see them bleeding and taken away in police cars. I said to my wife, let's stay in Valladolid till the afternoon because maybe there will be a news report on it. Maybe a news report in the back page of the local newspaper. This was national news. My mother-in-law called to tell us she was in another city. We've seen on television this. I, coming from New York City, thought, so a murder? That's just, who would bother reporting a murder? That's my country. Okay. So I mentioned this only because the person who committed the murder of the intruder was not taken to jail, was not taken to court, because they were protecting their own property. And that's okay. I should put it in this paper, but bring it in next time. I'll add it. So what I was going to say is a case has been made that revenge serves a social function in keeping society stable by making sure that nobody violates the norms. On an individual level, revenge is costly and dangerous since it gives rise to reprisals. In a paper which I'm going to be citing frequently called Revenge, a Multi-Level Review and Synthesis, published just in 2019 in the Annual Review of Psychology, the 3 authors, Jackson, Choi, and Gelfand, say, it is somewhat of a puzzle why revenge is so widespread. People typically have a natural aversion to aggression and confrontation. They are also typically self-interested, yet revenge is antithetical to both these tendencies. Neither does revenge seem to yield any personal gain. Perhaps most surprising is the fact that people don't even feel very good after acts of vengeance. Given these consequences, the question of why anyone would ever take revenge is important. The Odyssey itself illustrates the negative consequences of revenge. For the 108 suitors represented the cream of the youth of Ithaca and nearby islets, and they had fathers, brothers, cousins, friends, all eager to avenge their deaths. At the end of the poem, they are all seen climbing up the hill where Odysseus has taken his stand, along with his son, his rejuvenated father, and a couple of slaves. Is he prepared now to wipe out practically the entire population over which he ruled? Is this what revenge comes to? It seems that he is. So as he leaps into the air, sword drawn, whether he would have succeeded or not is moot. That means you don't know, because Athena casts a thunderbolt at his feet and insists that the warring parties be reconciled, and the poem ends there. What would have happened? What kind of revenge is this? The poem is asking us to reflect on these questions. Now, Jackson, Choi, and Gelfand also say, and I'm quoting them, cultural models imply that it is the feeling of being mistreated on the basis of normative standards of behavior that ultimately motivates revenge. Think of Achilles. You think you've been mistreated, regardless of whether revenge can deter future harm. When speaking of revenge's function, cultural models typically argue that revenge is not adaptive for individual people, but that it does help groups maintain normative homeostasis, stability. So they note further that some cultural, I'm quoting, evolutionary perspectives conceptualize revenge as most functional and so most likely to evolve in context without strong institutional laws, where victims of a perceived slight, notice the motive, perceived slight, it is exactly the language of Aristotle, as we'll see next time, must personally retaliate to restore justice. Now, such models and theories go some way to explaining why revenge might have had a cultural salience, importance in archaic Greece, where institutions were not as firmly established as they would later become. For example, in Athens, where a philosopher like Plato could compare people who seek revenge to wild animals. But the Iliad and Odyssey lost none of their prestige. And as I mentioned, Plato himself thought Odysseus was wise. And he had Socrates compare himself to Achilles, the Apology. Do stories of such extreme vengeance provide a vicarious satisfaction without necessarily encouraging similar behavior in readers and viewers? Is that what the Odyssey is doing? Giving us the sense of revenge, even though it's not, we don't are meant to carry it out ourselves? Odysseus represses his childhood nurse when she's about to ululate, about to cry out and scream over the slaughter of his suitors. He warns that such exultation is inappropriate at the death of fellow citizens. Perhaps the nurse is like an internal audience, like us. Her reaction is that of an observer. We want to scream out. But the perpetrator himself, Odysseus, cannot enjoy his triumph so unreservedly. Might Odysseus himself be experiencing something like perpetrator disgust? The poem itself celebrates his bloody victory, which included hanging 13 slave women of his own who would cater to the suitors in Odysseus' absence. Now, I have raised many questions today, and they will continue to engage us in the weeks to come. Avengers have a romantic cachet. They seem to represent a kind of rough justice and are perhaps at their most popular when people feel helpless or mistreated in their own lives. They are good to fantasize with, but they may also excite impulses that were better left dormant. Now it's time to hear your views on these archetypal Avengers. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, David, for this wonderful lecture. Eu queria dizer, eu não esqueci de falar no começo da apresentação, que esse texto foi divulgado a todos que fizeram inscrição via ideia. E assim acontecerá com as próximas 8 conferências, as próximas 7 conferências, essa foi a primeira das 8, né? O professor se dispõe a disponibilizar 2 dias antes a conferência que vai ser dada às quintas-feiras, tá? Além de ser projetada aqui. Bom, a gente tem aqui como moderador o meu colega professor Flávio Ribeiro de Oliveira, né? Queria registrar aqui a presença de algumas pessoas que eu não vi, porque eu estou usando óculos agora e esqueci. Então, seria a presença da professora Neide Barros, que é a professora de História Medieval do IFIS, o professor Luciano César Garcia Pinto, professor de Estudos Clássicos da Unifesp, o professor Alexandre Cunha, da área de Direito Penal, de diversas universidades, da Unip, inclusive. O professor Marco Raimundo acabou de sair, que é também ele é um diretor do grupo, coordenador de um grupo de inteligência artificial do IDEA. Desculpem se eu não estou vendo mais pessoas, porque eu estou realmente sem óculos. Eu falo da próxima vez. Eu vou dar a palavra, então. Você prefere, Flávio, fazer algum comentário? A gente ouve as perguntas antes. Há perguntas da plateia, comentários, colocações?
We have 250 or so participants out in the world of the ether, and they may have questions too. I will say, as we're waiting for questions to come in, that as we know, the problem of revenge is a big one today. We feel it, and we are going to look at the extent to which models like Homer's poems still affect us. We'll look at the Bible too, where the expression vengeance is mine comes from. We will look at other questions. For example, is vengeance a primitive instinct? Is it more common among tribal cultures than what we think of as civilized cultures? We will look into anthropologists' view, and some saying yes and some saying no. So our purpose now isn't to solve every question, but to raise them and make them visible to ourselves. There seems to be a question.
Well, what do you think? Well, somebody hurts me, and I hurt him back. It's revenge.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone hurts me, and the state hurts him back, is that revenge?
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question. If somebody hurts me and I hurt the person back, is that revenge? And if I leave it to, I take the person to court. We're going to raise this actually in the next few lectures. Should Achilles have taken Agamemnon to court? Should Odysseus have said, well, I'm back in Ithaca. Let's get an assembly together and we'll bring this 108 suitors up on charges. They occupied my house. I want a judgment made against them. Now, this would not have been a very satisfying conclusion to the poem. We get a court. Although some of you will have read Aeschylus's Oresteia, in which a conflict of a somewhat similar sort is precisely resolved in a court. Does this eliminate revenge, or is it a revenge on our acted out for us? It's once again, it's a very interesting question to which I am going to return, but by way of anticipation. In the United States today, what was not the case when I was a child, during the sentencing phase of a trial, there were two phases of a trial. The verdict, when the person is charged as guilty or innocent, and then if the person is guilty, what sentence do you give? How many years in prison, death sentence, and so on. In the United States, wherever there is a death sentence penalty, and that's true in every state today, you are obliged to have two phases. In the first phase, only the question, did he do it or did she not do it, can be raised. Everything else is prohibited. In the second phase, nowadays, victims are allowed to come into court and make a statement about how this crime affected them. I don't know whether this is true in Brazil, is it? In the United States, it has become extremely common. If you read about a crime, and we're going to be dealing with modern crimes of various kinds in lectures, you can. And so the victims come in and they scream and they cry and they tell about the loss of somebody who was murdered and they tell about the harm. They tell about what it meant to them. This is meant to dispose the judge or the jurors to increase the penalty. They are getting it out of their system. And a case can be made that this is allowing the justice system to offer the victims some sense of personal revenge. It's not just impersonal retribution. It is not just, you did this and so you suffer. So one of the questions we need to ask is what is the relationship between revenge and emotion? I go into revenge. I want to, somebody who says yes, hurt somebody, hurt me, or hurt somebody dear to me. What do I want? What do I want to do? Do I want to, let's say, well, let's give an example. That's an easy one. Somebody has stolen money from me. And we will look at some of these examples. Somebody's stolen money from me. A lot. Wiped out my bank account. What do I want to do? Get the money back? Is that enough? If all I say is, well, he has taken so much money, I take him to court, the court requires me to give back, and that's that. Finished. No problem. I've gotten justice. Have I gotten revenge? It doesn't sound like revenge, does it? It sounds like something more like just requital. That I've gotten back what I lost, and that's enough. Of course, if somebody is killed, you can't get that back, but that's why I use this other example. And justice looks like it's impassive, it's impersonal. It doesn't involve emotions. We're going to read for next time, next week, we're going to contrast two different views of how you react when you are harmed. One will be Aristotle, who says that if you are incapable of anger, you're like a slave. And the other is Seneca, a Stoic, who says we ought never to react in anger. If possible, we ought never to feel anger. Anger is the worst kind of motivation. So what do? I bring a person to justice without being angry. And that's the question that we face. Is civilized society, we could ask, is it asking us to repress a natural instinct? Is it asking us to forego revenge so that the justice system can work impersonally? We can avoid feuds. We can avoid having to take justice into our own hands. Or is it depriving us of something? I can only say that these are questions we're going to be going into all for the next 7 weeks after this. But it's an excellent question, and it's one that we should be attentive to.
Thank you very much, David. We have some questions from the other present audience. We had some questions also from the YouTube, and also from the University of Juiz de Fora and from the University of Manaus. So let's see. We have a question. Let me organize it. Maybe you could give the word to Thais, who is here, who raised the hand before. Nós podemos, não sei que língua eu estou falando, gente. Então, assim, não sei que língua eu estou falando mal. Podem fazer perguntas em português também, ou em espanhol, ele entende as duas línguas também.
You all look so relieved when Portuguese is spoken.
A minha pergunta é muito parecida com a do professor Flávio, fiquei pensando na questão da justiça em relação a esses casos como da Odisseia. Uma vez que uma vingança muitas vezes leva a outra, como no caso dos familiares dos pretendentes, ou na própria Odisseia, né, que uma vingança vai levando a outra, como a gente pode pensar nessa questão do que é justo? Se uma vingança leva a outra, uma ação foi justa? Forgiveness and justice. Actually, it's not forgiveness.
Forgetting.
No, is justice and revenge.
Justice and revenge.
Yes. When we have
Vingança,
a cycle of revenge, some person take revenge on another, and the another is going to take revenge on that same action. Is that justice? Is that we can think about this in the sense of an individual sense of justice or not?
Well, again, you're asking a follow-up question, as you said, to Flavio's question. And again, a good one. There are what are sometimes called mitigating circumstances. If somebody has me see, I put it another way. What happens when I take justice into my own hands? This is how we sometimes speak of it. So, somebody has harmed my brother, and I go out and hurt that person in return. What does the legal system think of this? Do they regard it as justice? It is certainly justice from one point of view. I will try next time to distinguish between revenge and retribution. And I will argue that they are distinct in relation to motive. If let's say, let me put myself in the place of Odysseus. I come home and there are 108 young men. They will hardly fit in my apartment, but okay, let's assume they're there. And there's my wife and my son, and they are abusing everything, and I now have to decide what to do. Well, as I said, I could take them all to court. Suppose I know that there's so many of them, and they're related to all of the judges, that the court won't condemn them. So I know they will get away with it. What do I do then? I am in a corrupt system where I am sure. So suppose I take vengeance myself, not now acting only out of anger, but acting because I believe that this is what they deserve, and the only way I can enact it is to do it myself, because the justice system will not serve. Am I acting out of revenge, or am I motivated by justice? This is the kind of question we need to ask ourselves, because there are many real life situations. Odysseus comes home to 108 young aristocrats. After he kills them, their families are coming together to avenge this act. What makes you think that if Odysseus had tried to bring them to trial, he would have won? Maybe he wouldn't have. Maybe the society would have said, well, you know, they thought you were dead. They were there legitimately. In any case, they're our relatives. We'll vote a minimum penalty. Trivial, something trivial. Never mind what they did to your house. So he's in a situation where what people often say is, you see, there were no courts in the Odyssey's time. It's an early tribal situation. And so Odysseus has no choice but to act himself. The only difference is, does he let his anger motivate him? Or is he motivated by a sense of justice? Is he acting the way Aristotle thinks he should act? Or is he acting the way Stoic Seneca thinks he should act? That would be the question. So it all then comes down to motive. Is that enough? Is that enough to make the distinction? These are real questions. I keep reminding myself that the Iliad and the Odyssey are popular down to today. Why do we enjoy them? Why do we feel a kinship with them? Why do we like Odysseus? He's a liar. He's a cheat. There were plays produced in Athens that describe him in very negative terms. Yet he's the hero of this great poem. Achilles is the hero. He backs out of war. I must say about Achilles, this doesn't come up later in my talk, so in the 19th century, many critics judged Hector to be the hero of the poem, not Achilles. Achilles is at war. His commanding officer has taken back a prize that he was given. That's his right. He gave the prize, he can take it back. Achilles has to serve in the army. An individual soldier cannot say, I will not fight because I have been dishonored. Your duty and your obligation come first. This was a common view among critics of the Iliad a century ago. It changed. Achilles seems surely to be the hero of the poem to us. How can we think of it as a poem showing what goes wrong when a person takes himself too seriously? When a person is willing to say, I wish my whole side would lose because I have been treated unjustly. Let me give you an example from today. As you probably know, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has tried to introduce legislation by which the Parliament would appoint judges to the Supreme Court and could overrule the Supreme Court when it disagreed with their judgment. So there would be no independent court. He has had to back down because there were massive strikes in Israel that stopped, for example, all flights. The unions were against it, but there wasn't just that. There were people refusing to serve in the army. And in the situation in which Israel finds itself, as you can imagine, that is dangerous for the state. Whatever side you're on, you can see the point. And that was clearly a menace. His own Secretary of Defense criticized his action and he fired him. And that's what led to the ultimate stage of confrontation. What will happen from now on is anybody's guess. But this is what led to it. Were they right? In an army, should you say, no matter what, you swore to serve, you serve. Politics are independent. If you've been insulted, if you have been wronged, that is independent. Your duty comes first. It's a real question. It's a question today. How do you conceive of your duty? When do you decide that the state itself is behaving unjustly? And therefore, you have what we sometimes call a constitutional crisis. The European term, probably in Portuguese too, is a state of exception. I imagine that you use the same phrase, a state of exception. It's when you impose military law and you argue that conventional rules do not apply. Well, then what are our obligations? Is this what happened to Odysseus? It's this kind of question that I think those poems raise for us when we look at them this way. When we look at them not just as heroic fantasy poems, but as poems that are raising deep moral questions in the very nature of their plot. We will, as I said, be coming back. I'm introducing comparisons now. These aren't comparisons that are part of the future lectures. I've written out most of the future lectures already. But they, and toward the end of the semester, or the course, I will hope to ask some of you, if you are willing, to write up very brief examples of such moments of conflict, such moments of where revenge comes into question that you know of in your personal lives, in the lives of people you know, or in your political lives. What should we be looking at and what should we be asking? And I may try to integrate them into the final lectures. So it's an excellent question, and I'm giving you a complicated answer.
David, thank you very much for another lecture while answering the question. We have here, don't be afraid, não fiquem apavorados. We have here 8 questions, but I will try to organize them. I'm trying to organize them so that we can associate the issue, the subjects, yes? So we have one question from the Professor Carol Martins da Rocha from the University of Juiz de Fora, and she tells us that her students were very, very impressed with the killing of the slaves by Odysseus, because he didn't not only kill the pretendents,
Yeah.
pretendentes,
Suitors, right?
but also the women and they were very impressed with the violence there and this revenge, and they ask themselves about the motivation, and if there is a question also of social hierarchy there involved. Another question there is related to the description of a just and unjust city in Achilles. Como é que fala? Escudo mesmo?
Shield.
Shield, of course. Achilles, no escudo de Aquiles. And the person who asked, I don't have the name here, but he reminds us that in this just city, essa cidade justa, there are the option of solving the conflicts, and while the other city uses revenge from.
This is true.
Yes,
Yeah, maybe I should stop with the first two questions because otherwise I'm going to forget what they want.
yes. The third question is about the presence. I think that it's related to the second. Comes from Erika Anglica, our colleague from London, and she asked about parallels between visual arts and literature, if we can think about the representation of revenge in visual arts in a parallel way to its representation in literatures. I'm making the link because we are talking about anekphrases. So they're the first three.
Okay. I think I remember all three. The first question has to do with Odysseus doesn't only kill the suitors, he kills 12 or 13 of the maids who have in his house. He has a lot of property, and there are lots of maids around, and some of them slept with the suitors. And he served them and were on their side. He does not treat this as a form that they were obliged to. Evidently, others did not. And he finds out, he asks, which were the ones that obliged the suitors? And he has them hung up on by the neck. And being Homer, he's very specific. He says, and they hung there until their toes stopped twitching, stopped moving. You have a very visual image of it. They're up there hung and their feet are trembling still until the toes stop. Homer is good at horror. He's very good at horror. So, why that? Ought he not to have considered that they were under compulsion? He makes a distinction that some of them were and some of them were not. One of the things he seems to think is that Penelope was in some danger, and that the slaves that betrayed her, and this is how he looks at it, were a threat to her and to his house. So the best I can say there is that loyalty matters to Odysseus. On the second question, which has to do with a shield, there, within the poem, in a peaceful city, there is, if not a court, there is arbitration. This was true even in Athens. Before you went to court, you could arbitrate. By arbitration, you bring an independent party and ask that you commit yourselves to following the judgment of that independent person. Who's in the right? And you agree that whatever that person says, what you'll do. So you don't go to court. You arrange it independently. You have this today, I'm sure in Brazil, equally in the United States, when trials are about to come, the lawyers come together to get a deal going. And in the United States, you know, we are replied, probably here too, to go serve on juries. Is that true here? A jury in a trial. Juries are citizens. And so every once in a while, you get a notification, I have to serve. And so you go to the court, and there are a whole bunch of people. And if there's a big trial, you can find yourself in the court for weeks. 99% of the time, everybody is sentenced. Why? Because just before the trial, the two people on both sides, these are civil trials, not criminal, the two people on both sides realize, I could lose. I'd better settle. Even if I don't get everything I want, I'll get something. Whereas if I go into this trial and I lose, I get nothing. And so the last minute, the trial doesn't take place. It happens frequently. So that I've been at several occasions and I've never had to actually serve on a jury. So this is arbitration. You can have it, and it is there on the shield. And it's one more example of what Ajax proposes, which is that you settle for a certain sum of payment. In fact, the two sides make a deposit of a certain amount of wealth before the trial goes on. So the third question is revenge in the visual arts. This is more complicated because we want, with revenge, to look at the motive. And the visual arts, you can only determine the motive if you already know the story. That's unless the visual arts are in the form of a series of panels and with captions. So if you just see somebody killing another person, even cutting their heads off, how do you know what the story is? How do you know what happened? How do you know why they're doing it? Under what conditions? So this makes it very difficult to judge. I'm trying to think if there are. Now, if we mean by the visual arts theater, then it's a different story. Because then there's a plot, there's a story, and yes, we can look at that next time.
Thank you very much. And now I will resume the 4 other questions because they are also related and sometimes excluded. So, does revenge flourish in the absence of justice? Or, this is question number 1. Question number 7. Does revenge necessarily contribute to social or legal balance? Or, question number 8. Is injustice a natural mechanism? Because we see so many examples of, after all, strong people versus weak people, and in the search of revenge. And finally, also a meta question: should epic really be thought as a source of ethical reflections? This was the question number 5, and I think and then we are done with that because we have 5 minutes, but we can stay a little bit more, of course. 5. So should epics really be regarded as a source for ethical thought? Put in another way, when Plato praises Odysseus, is he really praising all of his behavior as if Odysseus were a real person? Mm-hmm. So, does revenge flourishes in the absence of justice, or is it a contribution to social and legal balance, or neither of those? Yeah. Isn't just a natural mechanism, mm-hmm. or is yes?
Well, you saw that. We'll come back to this, by the way, in future lessons. But lectures, but if it is commonly thought that revenge flourishes where laws are weak or legal institutions are weak. Is it true? Certainly, active expressions of revenge may not, but what about the desire for revenge? What about the fact that I bring somebody to court because I want to see that person suffer? And I have the opportunity to make it. Is the instinct for revenge eliminated in a system of justice? Second, does revenge serve a larger social purpose? I mentioned today the argument of these three scholars who reported in a kind of summary of revenge literature that it is commonly thought that revenge may serve an evolutionary purpose, not on an individual level, but on a social level. In those places where revenge occurs, you get more stable societies. Where you have more stable societies, you have societies able to defend themselves. Where societies are able to defend themselves, they wipe out the other societies that are not. And so, revenge-oriented societies survive better, and have a genetic advantage. That's one of the arguments that is made. We're going to much later in the semester, in the two courses, but I'm going to give you a survey of societies that have capital punishment, called countries where capital punishment is okay, and how aggressive they are. And this has been a very detailed survey. And you will be amazed to see who comes out on top and who comes out on the bottom. You'll be amazed. I promise you. You'll be amazed. Brazil isn't in it. I don't know why, but 57, 53 or 54 countries. You will never imagine the countries that have low revenge scores and the ones that have high. I promise you, you will be surprised. And so, nevertheless, these are questions that are often asked about the utility of revenge. Now, the last question was on...
The last question. If,
Two questions. Yes, epic and morality.
yes,
Now, it's hard to say. We don't necessarily grow up with Greek and Roman epic, but even today, and 2 or 3 generations ago, a large number of people were brought up with the Bible. Now, revenge is a big topic in the Bible. Extermination of whole communities is not only occurs in the Bible, but God approves of it. It has been a source of trouble to some people who are believers. To others, it is natural. They have deserved their extinction. It is, but that these events occur in the Hebrew Bible is without question. Now you might say, well, the New Testament comes and transforms this up to a point. Jesus comes with a sword. He will divide brother against brother and father against son. And that's a sword. It's a makaira in Greek. It's not a pencil. It's not a fork. It's a sword. And so the question we want to ask is, how much violence is endorsed? You won't be entirely surprised to know that religious warfare has cost many lives. Is this because vengeance is justified? And to what extent do our sacred texts help us to believe that we are in the right? That's a good question for the Iliad and the Odyssey. My own feelings are that the Iliad and the Odyssey were meant to be exemplary. They were meant to show you something about approved values. They were used that way. But I have a colleague, a good friend, who has argued that the Iliad, maybe the Odyssey, were meant to show you just the reverse. They were long poems meant to show you what you should not do. And there may be some truth to it. At least they may be subjects for argument.
Thank you very, very much, David. Indeed, I think we could interrupt for today. I remember that next week we will have the second conference on Vingança versus Retribuição, Punição e a Lei de Talião. We will have as moderator a professora Natália Corazza, do IFIS, que trabalha com abolicionismo, justiça penal, e o professor Eduardo Henrique Aubert, não tem José, da USP, e também do Centro de Teoria da Filologia do IDEA, que trabalha com direito, com filologia clássica e história antiga. Na segunda-feira nós teremos o início, para quem se interessar por poesia arcaica, a esposa do professor Konstan dará no IDEA, fica aqui perto dos bancos e da reitoria, um curso de 2 horas presencial e online. São todos muito bem-vindos, muitíssimo obrigada. Obrigada também a Mônica Venturini por estar no chat do YouTube, ao Saulo Acácio, sem dúvida, ao Carlos, que fez essa instalação maravilhosa que nos permite transmitir pelo YouTube, e a toda a equipe do audiovisual e do IDEA. Boa tarde a todos.
Obrigado de my part.